Hi, welcome to Constitutional Chats, hosted by me, Janine Turner,
and Cathy Gillespie,
with students
Dakare, Chatman,
and me, Tova, Kaplan.
Join us as we discuss hot topic issues with constitutional experts. It's sponsored by Constituting America. I'm Janine Turner. Welcome to Constitutional Chats. We're thrilled you're with us today. Come on in. Okay, I'm going to introduce everybody. My name is Janine Turner. I'm the founder and co-president of Constituting America. I'm also an actress. You may know that. Northern Exposure is my claim to fame, one of my claim to fames, and you can find out everything at JanineTurner.com. I founded Constituting America in 2010 and co-president that's not good English, but nevertheless, with Cathy Gillespie, who's my dear special friend. And now we've been doing this it'll be 11 years in February. So that's how long we have been in existence. She's one of the 16 private citizens serving on the U.S. Semi-Quincentennial Commission, which is a big deal, helping to celebrate and plan the celebrations for our 250th birthday in 2026. Cathy is a former chief of staff on the Hill and former commissioner on the President's Commission on White House Fellows. Cathy, say hello, and I know you would like to thank our generous and most awesome sponsor.
Hi, thank you, Janine, and thank you for your leadership on Constituting America. It is just a pleasure working with you every day. We want to thank everyone for being here with us today, and especially our sponsor, Jay McConville and his wife, Sue, who are making this episode of Constitutional Chats possible. Jay is a member of our board, our governing board, and is such a big contributor to our programs in so many ways with his advice and his time and his energy and his enthusiasm. And Jay is a former CEO, a business owner, and he is now getting his PhD in public policy. And so, Jay, we are just so appreciative of you making today's episode possible. Thank you for all you do for Constituting America.
Yes, Jay. Welcome, 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 Jay. Thank you so much. And he's very debonair, and he I don't know, is he a Virginian through and through? I don't know.
Yes.
Okay, well that explains his manners. He has wonderful manners. Okay, I am going to put my watch on silent. Okay, next I'd like to introduce Tova Kaplan, who is now 17 years old. Tova is 17. She's a winner of our contest 3 times. She's our National Youth Director and runs our Youth Advisory Council. And I like to brag on her and say, like a CEO of a top 100 company. And we're thrilled that she's with us today. She helps us, along with Dakare, book these, schedule these. They write their own questions. She's truly exceptional. And you will see, she's also developing an app for Constituting America. So Tova Kaplan, who you will someday see as Secretary of State, I'm sure of it. Say hello.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for that amazing introduction, Janine. I love you and your jokes. You're amazing.
Now, Dakare Chatman, extraordinary Dakare Chatman. Dakare Chatman is 18-year-old student from North Carolina. He's graduating from college this year. He's traveled the world, actually. I'm getting to know all about his childhood. He is Constituting America's student ambassador. He serves on our youth advisory board. He's a 2-time winner of Constituting America's We the Future contest for PSA and short film. He's a working actor, and he will be seen in every episode, I believe, of season 2 of Netflix's hit series Outer Banks. And Dakare Chatman, who also he may be a politician because he believes that you have to be an actress, have to be politicians. So you may parlay that someday into the political world. But meanwhile, you'll see him clutching an Oscar someday soon, I know. Hello, Dakare Chatman.
Hello, everyone. I'm so glad to be here, and we hope you enjoy this chat. And thank you to our sponsors, because Lord knows that you guys definitely make a difference for us. So thank you for all that you do. And Janine, thank you for your introduction, and I'm excited to dive into this.
We're thrilled to have you here. Are you on set, Dakare?
No, I'm at Grammy's house. I'm in Grammy's house.
Okay, because I was You were on set earlier, and I was just going to say, if that is your set, if that's your trailer, then you are already Bruce Willis. You know, you're big time, because I never had a trailer like that ever. Just
No,
saying.
this is
Oh.
Grammy's house.
Okay. Well, Grammy has a beautiful house. Jeanette Cranack is truly a special, wonderful, wonderful, terrific person. And she has been with us, I don't know, 8 years. She'll tell us forever as well. And she books all the speeches that we do. We've given speeches to 42,000 students. I've given about almost 600 speeches myself. And Jeanette gives the speeches with us. And she's going to tell us how you can book a speech in your school or in your classroom, your civic organization. And the two things that we do two different kinds of speeches. She's a former elementary school teacher, which is why she's such a great speaker, PTS president, and operations director for Constituting America. Among her many duties, Jeanette handles all of our outreach to schools and school presentations, and she speaks to thousands of students across the country with me. Hello, and Cathy, and anyone else who joins us on the speaking circuit. Hello, Jeanette.
Hi, Janine. Hi, everyone else. Thank you for coming today with us, George. We really appreciate it. For those of you that would like to book a speech, please go to our website and click on the book a speech. And Janine and I will visit your class, your troop, your homeschool group, whatever you want.
Lisa Williams is our director of media, and she's a very, very talented editor. She is just a terrific person altogether, very patient with the two presidents. Anyone that gets to work with two presidents deserves an Oscar just for that. I think for Christmas, we're going to give Lisa an Oscar that says the most patient person in the world category.
Well,
but
thank
she's very
you.
talented editor. Hi, Lisa.
Hi, I'm not sure everyone in my personal life would agree with that, but I appreciate it. Thank you for that introduction. If you want to watch this or any of our other podcasts on demand, we put them all on the archive on our website. It's right under where you sign up for any of the constitutional chats. They're also, you can just search constitutional chats on anywhere that you stream podcasts, Spotify, the podcast app, YouTube. It's on our Facebook page. So thanks for coming to this one, and please be sure to check out our other episodes. And this is actually our 50th episode. So congratulations, everyone. 50 episodes this year. That's exciting. Well, I guess it will be 51, but 50.
There you go. This has been our COVID project. This has been our adaptation project, and it's been a lot of fun. All right, drum roll, please. Here we are with the 9th and 10th Amendments with our special guest, George Landrith. I'm going to tell you how special he is right now. He has written for many of our 90-day studies. Please check out, we're multi-tiered. Check out our 90-day studies. George Landrith is the president of Frontiers of Freedom, a public policy think tank devoted to promoting a strong national defense, free markets, individual liberty, and constitutionally limited government. Landrith is a graduate of the University of Virginia School of Law, where he was the business editor of the Virginia Journal of Law and Politics. That's a great law school. He is admitted to the bar in Virginia and California and is also a member of the United States Supreme Court Bar. As an adjunct professor at the George Mason School of Law, he has taught constitutional law and appellate advocacy. George is a regular contributor, as I said, of Constituting America's 90-Day Studies. And we're thrilled to have you here to speak with us about the 9th and 10th Amendments, which is always a bit mysterious to people. They don't really understand it, but it's actually very, very important. And if we understood it better, we might not have such a big, overwhelming, all-encompassing government, right?
That's the truth. That's the truth. Well, and I just want to thank you for that kind introduction. And I want to thank, Janine, it's great to be here with you. And it's great to have Tova and Dakare and Cathy and Jeanette here as well. I'm excited about this because the work that you all do is very, very important. Constituting America is doing something that matters. And the real reason for that is, America is a very special place, but it's not a special place because, for example, American dirt is better than dirt in other places. And it's not because our DNA is better than the DNA in other places. America is a special place because we have a system of government that recognizes and is built upon an important fundamental truth. And that is that we are all created equal and we are endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights. And our Constitution and the culture of freedom that it created makes America this great, amazing nation. and we're all blessed to be a part of it. So I think learning about this amazing document that unleashes human potential is critically important, which is why your work's so important. I want to make it clear, though, I'm an American, you guys are all Americans, so maybe we just feel that way because that's how we see it. But guess what? Lord William Gladstone, he was the British Prime Minister 4 times in the mid to late 1800s. He referred to our Constitution as the most wonderful work ever struck off at a given time by the brain and purpose of man. And I believe Gladstone was right. There is a genius to our Constitution. I would argue first, it's because, well, beyond the idea that we are created equal and have unalienable rights, it's based on the sovereignty of the people. That means we vote. But secondly, it also limits the power of the majority. The founders did not want a tyranny of the majority where effectively 3 wolves outvote the 2 sheep as to what's for dinner tonight. And then, of course, third, our Constitution places significant limits on the power of government. And fourth, our Constitution separates and divides power in numerous ways to create 3 co-equal and independent branches of government, extensive checks and balances, federalism, which we'll get to. And those are only a few of them. But let's get down to the nitty-gritty. The 9th Amendment. It says the enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others, meaning other rights, retained by the people. And the 10th Amendment says the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution nor prohibited by it to the states are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. Now, these 2 amendments are both aimed at placing a big exclamation point on the idea that powers of the federal government are limited and that natural rights are not to be usurped by government. It's almost like the founders were typing out a message to us and they did it in all caps, and made it like they're shouting. I remember the first time my kids told me that caps meant you were shouting, because when I was a kid, it was what you did like titles in and stuff like that. But anyhow, bottom line is the founders were shouting at us. And they were saying they were concerned about big government. They didn't want to create a big government that would become big and powerful and abusive. They'd already had experience with that. The British Crown and an elected parliament sent armies and navies and mercenaries to impose their will upon the Americans under threat of violence and even death. And so our founders wanted to make sure they didn't recreate that. So they created a government that would be strong enough to defend us from foreign powers, and also able to promote free trade among the states, but that would otherwise lack the power to squash the people's right to enjoy life and liberty in pursuit of happiness. The 9th Amendment reaffirms that fundamental truth that is expressed in the Declaration of Independence, that we are endowed by our Creator with unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, and that government is not the source of those rights or the giver of those rights. It simply exists to protect those rights. The 10th Amendment reaffirms the principle that our national government has strictly limited and enumerated powers, and that these powers, all other powers, are reserved to the people and the states. It makes it clear that we have the system of federalism. That's another check on the power of the federal government. But why was the Bill of Rights added almost immediately, including the 9th and 10th Amendment, after the Constitution was ratified? Was it because the founders forgot something important? And I would argue, actually, not really. The absence of a list of rights in the Constitution was not an oversight. They believed that the list of rights was unnecessary and even potentially dangerous. And their concern was that if you included a list of rights on a list, that later someone might use that list to argue that other rights not on the list were therefore not real. They weren't your right. And they didn't accept that view. They understood you had lots of rights. So they believed it was more effective to protect rights without listing them, and instead strictly limiting the powers of government. For example, by not giving the federal government the power to regulate speech or religion or press, they had protected free speech and freedom of religion and press, so forth. So bottom line is, but they saw that as the main bulwark of our freedom. But during the ratification process, it became clear that many Americans actually wanted a Bill of Rights. So one was written. But the 9th and 10th Amendments were included to make sure and address this original concern that they had, to make it doubly sure that listing some rights didn't end up coming back to bite us and end up limiting our rights. And so they include the 9th and 10th Amendments, which are kind of different than the other 10 amendments because they don't read in the same way. They're kind of a reaffirmation of what the founders thought. So with that, I'll be quiet and let's have a good conversation.
Thank you, Dr. Landrith. As I'm listening to you, I would like for you to break down two big words for our younger students, but not quite yet, because I want to talk about something else first. Enumerated. I mean, I know what that means. It means numbered, but I think it's good and federalism. It's interesting because federalism in my mind means one thing, but it actually means something else, like levity. The word levity to me should mean level. Things are like calm and level, but levity actually means funny. So if you could break down those two words for our younger listeners. But first, what is interesting to me as I heard you listen to you break that down is Amendment 9, where it says the enumeration, the numbered laws, rules in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people. That's the whole reason they didn't think we needed a Bill of Rights right there, because
Exactly.
That was their argument. Hamilton's argument and everybody else's argument. They were saying, wait a minute, we listed specific things in the Constitution, and so that all these other things that you have normally, we didn't take those away from you because it's very specific. And so it's all the other rights are retained by you. Isn't that in essence the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists were fighting? And this is what the Federalists were saying. You don't need this. You don't need the Bill of Rights. Number 9 kind of sums everything up, doesn't it? About how the Federalists believe.
Exactly. That's why it was included. It was included for that exact reason, just to say, okay, fine. You guys want us to list the rights out. We'll list them out. But we're going to emphasize that this list is not exhaustive. This is not every right you have. These are just some of the basic fundamental rights that in our experience in the last decade or so, we've seen the government we were dealing with transgress. And so, you see, for example, the Third Amendment, probably not that important to any of us, but because for 200 years, nobody has forced you to put soldiers in your home and kicked you out of your house and said, we're taking over your house so we can put soldiers there. So quartering soldiers isn't a big issue anymore, but it was to them because they'd experienced that. So the point is, you're exactly right. The 9th Amendment does exactly that. Now, enumerated, all it really is getting at is the idea that in Article 1 of the Constitution, which is Article 1 is the article that deals with the legislature and the House and the Senate, basically. In Section 8, it lists all the actual powers that Congress has. And what's interesting is it's not a very long list, and it's a very specific list. They don't have the power, for example, to make kids go to school. So if you have truancy laws, they're not coming from Congress because Congress has no power to do that. State legislatures have that power. And so state legislatures may do it if they choose to. But so the point is,
define the word truancy.
Oh, I'm sorry, truancy. It's the idea of, most states have laws that are called compulsory education laws. So up to the age of 18 or K through 12, virtually every state, I think every state requires you to go to school unless there's certain exceptions that are met. And so if you don't show up to school because you're out, playing video games somewhere, they can actually, send a policeman to your house to come grab you and bring you to school, and you can get in trouble.
So the states are doing that, not the federal government.
Exactly, not the federal government, because the federal government has no such authority. If you read Article 1, Section 8, it's things like coin money and create an army and a navy and, things that you kind of expect the federal government to do. To be honest, a lot of the things the federal government does today actually aren't on that list. It'd be nice if they'd go back and reread that, but that's another topic.
And describe federalism in a kind of lightning round answer, because
Sure.
I want everyone else to be.
Federalism is just this idea that you have a federal government, meaning a national government in Washington, D.C., and you also have a government in your state, wherever you may be. In Virginia, that's in Richmond, and it doesn't, every state has a state governor, a legislature, a governor, and these two governments both are legitimate. And they have some areas where they overlap a little bit, but generally speaking, we have the state government of Virginia is not involved in determining what our foreign policy is. That's the national government function. By the same token, we just run schools.
Federalism means there's a national government and a state government, essentially. But,
Right.
Where I've been tripped up with that word is I was always saying that Washington, D.C. was the federal government, but that's not
Right.
an accurate statement.
They would have seen it as the national government. We talk about it as the federal government now because the Federalist Papers and other things, but you're right. They would have referred to it as the national government, and then federalism is this idea of both a federal or a national government and a state government, and they both exist, and they have their spheres to operate in.
Think about how many people actually get that wrong. They say the federal government, but actually that's not what that means. It means the federal and the states, or federal. Yeah. Anyway, so the government in Washington, D.C. is the national government. Federalism it means we have a divided government within states and national and D.C.
Yeah, and federalism means that every state becomes a laboratory for freedom. And sometimes you'll have states that do stupid things that turn out bad, and other states look and go, yeah, that didn't work out very well. We're not doing that. And the founders intended that. The idea was one of the things that tyrants have always looked for is to lock down everybody at once and to do their thing. So they might say, oh, this is what I want to do as a tyrant. And their attitude was, we're not going to make that easy. We're going to make them basically take over not just the government in Washington, D.C., they're going to take over the government in 50 states, or back then 13 states. And that becomes a harder task if you want to become a tyrant. You couldn't just take over one place. You had to take over, back then, 14 places, now 51.
That moving on now to Tova, that is most thought-provoking, though, that refers actually to the 10th Amendment, which is, if anything that the national government doesn't do, it reverts back to the states. Because what it's teaching us is that a tyrant can't just come over and say, everyone has to do what I say, the states have to agree. And we've really seen that with COVID. I think this is a great example of the COVID experience. Some wear masks, some don't have mask mandates, of how a federalism where the government is not telling, each state gets to speak out and say how they want to handle this crisis. Okay, Tova, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. So I find this discussion of federalism really, really interesting. And I was wondering, the way they set up this federalist system, was it an innovation in government, or were they continuing from a form of government that already existed in other countries?
Probably a little bit of both, to be honest. So we had colonial governments in the various colonies, but then not states. There was a colonial, Williamsburg, where there was the House of Burgesses and so forth. But that was the legislature, and you had that all around. But on a practical matter, there was a lot of innovation here, and it was a pretty significant innovation. Our founders were very, very interested in learning from history. And so they took bits and pieces, you could of different ideas that they'd seen throughout history. And then they tried to tweak them and fix them so that we didn't repeat mistakes that had been made. So the answer is there's a little bit of both to that. I think your question actually is quite perceptive, because it's some of both.
Great. And was there a difference of opinion between the founders about whether we should have a more nationally based or more federally based government? And could you kind of summarize those debates for us, if so?
Sure. Yes. Like everything, intelligent people have differences of opinion. And, these were very, very smart people. So they had difference of opinion. You had some who wanted a very strong national government, and they were less worried about recreating the monster they just escaped. They were all a little worried about that, don't get me wrong. Some were very worried, some were pretty worried. So you had some who wanted a stronger national government, some who wanted a more ineffective government. That's why we, for example, started off with the Articles of Confederation, which was basically a very, very weak national government. And it was so ineffective that the country was likely to fail as a country. And so that's when you came to the Constitution, which strengthened the government a bit, but still focused on keeping it weak enough that it would never repeat what they had experienced with the British Crown and the British Parliament. What's interesting there is Parliament was an elected body. And so our founders learned that an elective body can also be tyrannical. And but bottom line is there was that difference of opinion. And so it was their goal was to try to find a compromise that was somewhere in the middle, strong enough, but not too strong. A little bit like I've got some grandkids now, and the three bears, Goldilocks and the three bears, too hot, too warm, too hard, too soft, or just right. And the founders were trying to find it just right.
Wow, thank you. And I was wondering, do you think the power of the states has been diminished over time since then, or what is that? How have the powers evolved throughout time?
Well, again, a very perceptive question. Clearly, I think over time, the state's power has diminished. And certainly, if you look at that issue by issue, you could say on some issues that's a good thing, on some issues that's not a good thing. But as a general proposition, it's probably a problem for us. And that doesn't mean that that every argument that's occurred in our history that involved, federalism as a principle wasn't necessarily a good thing. But what I'm getting at is today there's a culture that a lot of times when someone sees something that's wrong, they say to themselves, Congress should do something. But they don't ask themselves, well, maybe my county government or maybe my state government should do something, or maybe I should do something. Instead, we all have kind of grown comfortable with this idea that that Washington, D.C. is where it all happens and where it should all happen. And I think that's very dangerous for the reason I described earlier. Our founders wanted to divide power in so many different ways. They wanted to make it difficult. Our founders didn't want a system where one person could be in charge. They wanted a system that was going to make it practically impossible. And I would argue we've had some pretty mediocre Congresses and some pretty mediocre presidents, but we've survived that because of this principle that no one person or one body has all the power. So it's been, I think, to our advantage and our benefit.
That's great. Wow. And if there was a figure or somebody in the national government that tried to expand those powers in a way that was in violation of this amendment, what would happen? Like, would it go to the courts? Is there anything we as citizens could do? Would the states have to deal with that? Could you talk us through that process?
Sure. Right now, probably the predominant place you would go is the courts. So eventually you go to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court has at times ruled, even though I think they have probably emphasized the 10th Amendment less than they ought to. We have had instances where the Supreme Court has said, yeah, this is a violation of the 10th Amendment. No can do. That's important. There was a time when there was other built-in things. For example, senators were actually not elected by the people, but were selected by the state legislature. The 17th Amendment changed that. And so now there isn't quite the same structure in place to protect the interests of the states. An example would be unfunded mandates. You see all kinds of unfunded mandates. You can't really like those very much if you're a state legislator, because you have Congress basically forcing you to increase taxes as a politician in your state to meet with a federal mandate. And yet there's nothing you can really do about it because you don't control anything. Whereas in the old way, the founders designed it, you did. You could recall your senator and say, why are you making me raise taxes on my people? You're done, buddy. And you'd send a different senator. And so there'd be this accountability, whereas now we don't have that same level. So I think that's part of the, but you're right, the courts today would be the primary way you would enforce this concept of federalism.
Sorry, do you think federalism gets more difficult as the country gets larger, or do you think federalism is the opposite and actually helps still maintain a government as the country gets larger?
I would argue that as the government gets larger, or as this country gets larger, federalism is ever more important. And what I mean by that, because it keeps government closer to the people. The government that's the most responsive tends to be city council or county government, because you can actually know the people and so forth. And then state government's a little further removed, but still more responsive. By the time you get to the federal government, it's so big that it's not nearly as responsive. You're just one of 330 million people. And so I think that as the country gets bigger, we ought to be more interested in federalism than ever, because let's be honest, in 1790, the country wasn't that big. And you could actually walk into the president's office and not have an appointment. What are the chances any of us could go walk into the president's office today and say, hey, what are you guys up to? Back then, you actually could. So my point is, I think federalism and keeping government personal is so much more important today than then, because it was so much smaller. So it was naturally more personal then, not anymore.
The way you just described the way the national government can impose federal mandates on the states and make the states raise taxes, and they don't, this is an example, but they don't want to, they have no recourse because they no longer elect the state's legislatures no longer send their own senators, so they can't recall their senators and say, we don't like what you're doing. I think that was really, really a wonderful example of why the 17th Amendment wasn't really a good idea. Another thing that I just want to mention and go to Dakare is how we now think in this country that everyone in the country should think the same. And what our founders wanted is not this one size fits all mentality, obviously on big things, but I mean, there seems to be the mentality that people get really upset if someone in Texas doesn't agree with exactly what Seattle's doing, or, you know, whatever. There seems to be this mentality now that everyone needs to think the same. And that's where we've lost our individuality. Right. Because there's this one size fits all where people think national government instead of the states have the right to be. That's what individualism really means. And that's what our founders wanted to protect, is that we had the opportunity to have our own thoughts and to think differently than other states. And that's what they were trying to preserve that. And that's what I think is really in danger of being lost. Okay, Dakare, your turn. You have 10 minutes and Cathy has 10 minutes.
Okie dokie. Tova, great questions, by the way, because a lot of them I had. So I guess you just kind of like were in my head. But kind of piggybacking off of something she had asked you, do you think that due to I guess presidents changing every 4 years and, you know, representatives changing, do you think that has anything to do with like states' rights just going like up and down and like the level of federalism in the country?
Well, definitely national politicians, meaning ones that are in the national government, if they're more mindful of federalism and the importance of it, then obviously it kind of like the tide, it rises a bit, and that's a good thing. And then you sometimes have politicians who don't respect that much, and kind of like Janine was talking about, where they have this idea that everybody needs to think the same thing, we need the same rules everywhere. Then it recedes, the tide goes out. And I would argue that federalism is not just a mechanism that's dated. It's actually this idea that government should be close to us, that we should have a say in government. And so the federal government was designed, or the national government was designed to deal with things like national security, the security of our borders, and international trade agreements and those kinds of things. But it wasn't designed to deal with all the day-to-day stuff that government does. And so the bottom line is, as federalism ebbs and flows, I think you see improvements when we have politicians in place that respect it. And I think you see us take a step back when we have politicians in place that don't. Because as I said, there is no longer a systematic way to defend federalism. Federalism kind of died a little bit when we went to the direct election of senators, because there was no mechanism. We have separation of powers. We have all these other things that institutionalize things. But what institutionalizes structurally the idea of federalism? And the answer is that we got rid of that thing, that there was such a thing. It was the fact that senators were selected by the legislature, in other words, the state government. And then we, of course, elected them. So we still had a say in it, but it wasn't direct. But I think that was probably a step backwards, to be honest.
Trying to think of some. Another question I want to because I know you talked about truancy in the beginning and how that's mostly a states thing. So if someone wanted to, I guess, sue the state for that, that would never go onto the Supreme Court and could never be deemed like unconstitutional or anything like that.
Generally, you're probably right. It could go to the Constitution. It could go to a Supreme Court if there was a federal issue involved. In other words, if someone were able to articulate an argument that their constitutional right as defined by the US Constitution were being abridged by a state, then it could find its way into court. But I'm not sure how a truancy argument would do that. But you could see as someone, for example, you could see it's possible, hopefully not in today's world, but where truancy requirements could be only applied to some people and that everyone else gets a pass. Well, then that might be an equal protection violation, meaning that it's important that we all be treated equally under the law. So, but in general, you're right. There are state issues and there are federal or national issues, but the Constitution does give us certain basic, and that doesn't give them to them, God gave them to us, but the Constitution guarantees certain things like equal protection, meaning that if you and I go before the Supreme Court, we both have to be treated the same. And they can't say, oh, well, we know George, or I've watched Dakare and he's great on TV, so he gets special rights, or oh yeah, George has argued cases here, so he gets special rights. No, guess what? We both walk into court with those same rights. At least that's the way the system's designed.
I think that is a great example of the Declaration of Independence. We're all created equal. People want to know what that means. And that means that we're treated equally in the law as one of the main.
Well, thank you, George. This has been great. Jay McConville, who is a member of our board and our sponsor for this episode, asks, the powers that the national government commonly exercise seem to be, upon reading the Constitution, greatly expanded from what the original text would support. Given the 10th Amendment, what has been the general method of accomplishing this expansion? And I would just add on to Jay's question, has it been that the states, maybe the state attorney generals, haven't challenged enough 10th Amendment violations, or how has the federal government managed to expand its power so much?
The courts really have de-emphasized the 10th Amendment. I used to joke, and I don't mean I joked like I like the joke. I mean, I would joke that the 10th Amendment had been repealed by the court. And there was a time in our jurisprudence where it was. For example, there was a case, Wickard v. Filburn. They held that a farmer who was on his own farm planting wheat and using it to feed his family and his livestock was part of interstate commerce. And he wasn't near a boundary or anything. And they'd said it because he, quote, affected interstate commerce, meaning he wasn't going to buy his wheat from the markets that maybe were somewhere else. If that's true, then there's no such thing. Everything's interstate commerce. Me sitting in my house deciding not to chew gum is interstate commerce, if that's true. So my point is, the courts have gotten to a point where they just sometimes they're not serious. Sometimes the courts are just dead wrong. And I think we sometimes think them, oh, they're wearing those black robes and they're so smart, they must be brilliant, they make a mistake. No, they've made some big mistakes. But I think, Cathy, you also make a good point, which is some state attorney generals have not been as aggressive in defending their rights. But sometimes they have been, and you've had Supreme Courts that have kind of, not that the Wickard v. Filburn case that I described was about federalism, but what it showed is a court's unwillingness to follow a very clear directive in the Constitution. And they just blew it off. And their decision demonstrated either that they were incredibly stupid, or they just didn't care very much and they were more interested in expanding government power, and they did.
Does that stand today? If I wanted to grow 100 acres of wheat at my ranch, I wouldn't be allowed to do that because that would be interfering with interstate commerce. I can't. What about the people that grow cantaloupe on their ranch and go sell it in a stand on the side of the street? Is that interfering with? I don't really understand that, how that would be applicable today.
Most of those government regulations, New Deal regulations, are no longer in force, so it's not technically at issue. And while Wickard v. Filburn has been, in some cases, fortunately, the Rehnquist court, Rehnquist was pretty conservative and an originalist in terms of how he saw that. They cut back on a lot of the things that Wickard v. Filburn stood for, but technically the decision wasn't overtly overturned. So it still has some play, and occasionally different courts have, it's made a little resurgence at times. So it's unfortunate. I think we, if we were to pass an amendment to the Constitution, mine would be this: we said what we meant, and we meant what we said.
It seems that would be a gross violation of his Ninth Amendment to bring this to full circle. That hey, it doesn't say anywhere in the Constitution that I can't grow 200 acres of wheat. You can't.
Right. Yeah, and the Congress clearly has no authority to regulate commerce that occurs only within a state. And so obviously, if this is only occurring on his farm, that's not on the border, then it's not interstate commerce. So the idea that this court held this way was simply because, quote, there was an emergency, the depression's horrible, we have to fix this, and so we're gonna let Congress do whatever they want. And that's dangerous, and it leads to results like this. Emergencies ought not be excuses to trample people's rights. Because to be honest, throughout history, every tyrant has come up with emergencies that they were trying to fix. Even Hitler claimed he had emergencies that he was trying to fix.
Well, in communist Russia, it's the same thing.
Yeah, I've heard of some governor's candidates and attorney general's candidates as part of their platform while they were running, saying that they would actually establish an office of the 10th Amendment in their offices just to look for 10th Amendment violations throughout the federal government that were impacting their state. And I don't know if any of those states, I don't know if any of these type offices have actually been established, but I always thought that was a good idea when I heard that idea.
A very good idea. And then it would be also a good idea if the court would, when they heard those cases, would bother to read the 10th Amendment and realize that despite my joke, it hadn't been repealed.
Just turning to the 9th Amendment for a second, Bill Herrenberg asked a question that I also had. And he writes, in looking at the 9th Amendment, a thought came to mind about what other rights there are. Over the years, have there been examples of rights that might have been included in the original Bill of Rights, but were omitted? And now with hindsight, we see they should have been included. And I would add on to that, when I was doing a little reading and I saw that the 9th Amendment has very rarely been mentioned in Supreme Court cases. And so I was just wondering, does that mean that that people have not, in taking cases to court, people have not felt historically their rights have been violated in within the realm of the 9th Amendment, or what do you think has caused that?
There are, I think, have been your observation is correct. The 9th Amendment has not been a hotbed of constitutional litigation. We haven't had a ton of cases on it. I think we probably should have, but we haven't. Again, I think part of that's the court's fault, because they've never really encouraged it. People have brought 9th Amendment cases and they've swatted them aside and acted like, that's dumb, why are you bringing that case? Our founders intended, they had this concept of natural rights. In other words, their view is that you were endowed by your creator. I would argue that the Declaration of Independence is a beautiful articulation or statement of natural rights. And you're endowed by your creator with unalienable rights. Unalienable means you can't sell it, you can't give it away. You're stuck with it. There's nothing you can do about it. It's yours. Like if you have, for example, a car, it's not unalienable. You can sell it, you could drive it off a cliff if you want, you could get rid of it, whatever you want. But your rights are not alienable. You cannot get rid of them. And they believe this. And their view of this was there was a lot of different rights. So, they weren't actually written anywhere. So if someone said, well, what were they? It was just kind of understood at that time that we had these rights. The example would be if you ever found yourself when, government says you must do X or you must do Y, kind of asking yourself, well, what gives them the right to do that? What? And that might be, it's essentially running up or bumping up against your sense of natural rights. Maybe, if it were something where they said you can't say that, you'd go, oh, that's First Amendment. But what if it weren't quite so clear and you've kind of said to yourself, but I feel like I have this kind of innate right. That's what the founders were talking about. And they believed in those innate rights. Some could argue, well, that's kind of amorphous. Perhaps it is, but it wasn't that amorphous to them. And I think if we spent more time thinking about it in our society, it wouldn't be to us. But we don't talk about it much, and we certainly don't have a lot of classes on it where you talk about natural rights. Some people act like if you talk about natural rights, you're an idiot. There have been people in in confirmation hearings who've acted as if the conversation about natural rights is a bad one, and it demonstrates you're not a serious person. And I would argue that if you can't accept the idea that there are rights out there that we have not put on a piece of paper and listed out, then maybe you're not a serious person.
Well, and speaking of those rights, Jeff Rimbold asked, do you think antitrust laws are a violation of the 9th and 10th Amendments? And also, what about vaccine mandates?
Okay, so vaccine mandates, I think, are perhaps the easier one to tackle because they're less complex. I would argue that it's very difficult, and I've been vaccinated. My kids have been vaccinated. I'm not saying that vaccines are innately bad, but I'm very uncomfortable with the idea that government's going to tell people, you must stick this needle in your arm. I have a friend who, for example, who got a flu vaccine, and they lost the use of their legs because that's one of the stated side effects that is almost never discussed. So I'd be very uncomfortable with the idea that people have to take a vaccine, because does the government have the right to stick a needle in her arm and make her in a wheelchair for the rest of her life? I'm not sure they have that right. So, but at the same time, I'm not against vaccines. I'm just pro people making choices in their own life. I'm not going to make, if you need a certain cancer treatment to survive, I'm not going to make you get it. You get to decide that, not me. And, to me, it's just that principle of liberty and freedom that matters there. And now you had asked about antitrust law as well. Antitrust law is very, very complex. Under the argument that they can regulate interstate commerce.
We need time out. We need to explain that to our younger audience. They're not going to know what antitrust means.
Okay, fair enough. Antitrust law is the idea that a business can't essentially corner the market and become the only purveyor of that. And then they use that power, like if you wanted to buy bubble gum, but they drive all the other bubble gum manufacturers out. So they're the only one, and then they can raise the price. They don't have to respond to normal market competition and so forth. So that's what antitrust is. It's this idea of we're not going to let monopolies exist. We're going to have a competitive marketplace where the market, helps control prices and quality, because you want to compete with the 14 other people that make bubble gum. And that's an important principle. The Constitution gives Congress the power to regulate interstate commerce. So to the extent that somebody is using their power in a marketplace to corner the market and drive competitors out of business so that they can then, charge more or, do other things to enrich themselves and use their monopoly power, as it were, to accomplish that. I think it's probably not an inappropriate use of power. At the same time, I think some things have been done in the name of antitrust law or regulating monopolies that have been counterproductive. So I think it's, again, a question of how, and it's a complex question, and it would require us to probably spend a couple hours trying to get through all the different ins and outs if we're to say this one's okay, this one's not okay.
Well, thank you. And finally, Nan Nickel asks about the 14th Amendment, how it affected the Bill of Rights. And then I guess specifically, I would add with the 9th Amendment, how did the 14th Amendment affect the states maybe implementing the bill of the Ninth Amendment in their own states.
Fair enough. Absolutely. So the 14th Amendment was passed just after the Civil War, and it says that if you are born in the United States or you're naturalized in the United States, that you are a citizen. Effectively, for example, at that time, its most important impact was it made every former slave a citizen of the United States. It also said that that no state could make or enforce laws which abridged the privileges and immunities of the citizens of the United States. So privileges and immunities are the ideas that, as a citizen, we have certain rights. And so they couldn't make laws that said, well, some rights are for George, but not for Janine, that we both had those rights. It also said that we couldn't be deprived of our life, our liberty, our property without due process of law. What that means is, like, they might deprive me of my liberty by putting me in jail. If I rob a bank, I might go to jail for that, but they can't just throw me in jail and accuse me of it. They actually have to have due process of law, which is a court hearing, the chance to appeal, a chance to present evidence, etc. So, and then of course it has the provision in it that we all have the right to equal protection. And so what has happened is the 14th Amendment arguably applies, the first 10 amendments, for example, only applied to the federal government or the national government. They did not apply to states. So if a state wanted to outlaw certain speech, technically they could. At least the Constitution didn't prohibit it. And this applies, this effectively has been viewed by the courts to apply to the states many of the provisions of the first 10 amendments, and so forth. So, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. The idea that free speech is important, I think it's important whether it's federal government or whether it's state government. But bottom line is, the 14th Amendment did more than simply do the things I just described. It's been viewed as expanding. So now state governments can't abridge your right to free speech. Whereas in 1820, if I'd brought a lawsuit saying my county government shut down my business because they didn't like the way I was advertising or something, they'd just say, tough luck. Government can do that. Now I'd have a claim because that applies to state government as well.
They all do that. Yeah. Okay. Hey, this has been so informative. Thank you. I hope everyone watching enjoyed today. I thought you were just simply terrific. Really terrific. Thank you. Very clear, very informative, really, really special. So thank you for joining us today. And we want to thank our sponsors again. I'm going to turn over to Cathy to do that. We want to thank our sponsors again. We want to thank our sponsors, Jay and Sue McConville, once again. Thank you so much for making today possible. Okay. Thank you, everybody, for joining us.